Okay. My name is Ken Wright, and I was born and raised in Scotland, a little town called Stirling. It's quite famous actually. It goes back to, we have a castle there that was first built by a fort by the Romans against the Picts in Scotland, and 500 BC, so everything is quite ancient. I grew up in an area which is famous for many battles, Stirling Bridge, William Wallace and so on. There were two generals there. Wallace was one, Murray was the other one. Unfortunately, Murray was killed in the Battle of Stirling Bridge, and then, of course, I grew up within about half a mile of that site. And the other side of town, half a mile away, was the famous Battle of Bannockburn, when Robert the Bruce defeated the English back in 1314. So growing up in history was quite normal. You got to know it pretty thoroughly going through school, and it stood me in good stead over the years. I was, let's see, 15 rather, when the war broke out in Europe. And of course I knew sooner or later I'd be called up, and I'd always wanted to be interested in flying, so naturally I wanted to get into the Air Force. I had to be 18, and on my 18th birthday, which happened to be on the day after Pearl Harbor, and I'd never heard of Pearl Harbor. It was a sheer coincidence on my part, so I have to explain exactly. I had nothing to do with Pearl Harbor. It wasn't a patriotic gesture. In fact, in Scotland, the streets were happy with people jumping, happy with the fact that America was going to be in the war. We'd been on our own for 2 years by that time. So it was a big day for us, but not quite a celebration in America, of course, with the casualties that happened at Pearl Harbor. Anyway, I quit school at the age of 16 and got a job in an accountant's office, worked there for about a year, then switched over to the post office and worked there for a year, sorting class and telegraphist. Of course, we didn't do any telegraphy in those days, it was passé by that time. Anyway, I got a pretty good grounding in geography, not only in Britain, but in the rest of the world, handling all the different mail addresses and so on. Anyway, I reported to boot camp with a buddy I didn't know him in Civvy Street, but they'd been in a Catholic school, and they had their own educational system at that time. Now it's all one in Scotland, but at the time, the Catholic schools were a separate entity, and of course were mainly by the nuns. Anyway, I joined up and met a fellow, and we were together actually for about almost a year, right till we went over to Canada to train. We reported to London to boot camp and got kitted out with our injections and all the paraphernalia and uniforms and so on. We had about 3 weeks there where we learned to walk without bumping into each other, and then did a slight refresher course on mathematics down at a coastal town in Sussex called Brighton, right on the seafront. It was a great town really for, in peacetime it had been a very place to go for seaside holidays and so on. And we were billeted in a big hotel right on the waterfront, which was very good indeed, but it was a good landmark. And one of my first encounters with the enemy fire was we'd just come back from a run down the seafront with a whole bunch of us, and we just got back into our rooms when I looked out the window, and there was 2 aircraft coming in towards the building. And one in front was the ME, a 190, followed by a Spitfire, which from our aircraft recognition training, I managed to recognize right away. So we all dived for the floor because we could see the guy was aiming straight at us. If he'd opened fire, he'd certainly have shot 2 or 3 at least in the building. But anyway, he zoomed up over the town and got shot down further inland. So that was my first encounter of enemy fire. It was really quite quiet, actually. Sitting outside on the esplanade was an anti-aircraft gun. And of course, unfortunately for the crew, they had the thing in bits. They had these guns placed so many yards apart all the way along the seafront. It was a handle and shooter type aircraft. And unfortunately, it was on a cycle that had to recalibrate the anti-aircraft gun every so often, and it was all in bits, so they never got to fire the damn thing, and they were not pleased with the results of that. It was probably the only shot they would get at an enemy aircraft, and they had the thing in pieces. Anyway, that was first of my initial training. We moved down to number 5 initial training wing down in Torquay, which was followed down the west coast in Devonshire, still on the coast. It was a big seaside resort, and all of the hotels had been taken over by military, and they were used for billeting all the air crew, where we did our initial training wing. Excuse me. And there we learned the basics of Morse code and so on. You had to be capable of doing at least 6 words a minute. Most of us were able to get up to around 12 or 15. Well, some of us did anyway. I was fortunate to be able to do that. And then you learn the Morse code, all the slants, all your physical training, and you got into the intricacies of navigation. And we were all budding air crew and didn't know we were going to finish up. I think I was going to finish up as a bombardier, or a bomber as we call them, and which was quite a fascinating job, and I didn't mind as long as I got in it. I never read. It was academic as to where I sat with the thing. So that was where I did my initial training. We did about 3 months of that. I did quite a lot of calisthenics and running, and quite a lot of cross-country running. And we did what we call escape and evasion exercises, where they drop us off in some secluded spot and then give us so many hours to get back to base. And of course, down in the West Country, it was pretty wild, but you managed to find your way around, map reading and so on. So we learned basic skills, which was pretty good for us in the future. Anyway, I graduated from that, and we went up to a place, a holding unit, and it was an armament school where we got into the bits and pieces of what made a 303 Boeing machine gun operate. And we got pretty good at that. We could take the thing apart and do it blindfolded, which was quite something. I didn't get the firework down there at that time, but it was part of the training. We didn't get to do the firing any live shots of any kind. So we went from there again into another holding unit. Well, it was a case of time. The bomb command was expanding at a rapid rate, and a bit of a battle was ensuing in the training side of it. So we got sort of oddball jobs to do in the meantime. And we finished up at a place called Heaton Park, which is in the outskirts of Manchester, on the west coast of England. And there we had to wait, it seemed eons, but it was only a matter of a couple of months. And we eventually were allocated to go overseas. We didn't know where we'd be going, but we had a choice of America, Canada, or South Africa and Rhodesia. So we finished up, we sailed to Canada, and I sailed on the Queen Mary, which was quite something. I'd seen her being built as a kid when my cousin lived in the Clydebank where the ship was built, so I was quite familiar with it. And we had a bit of an honour on it, because sailing with us at the time was the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. He was on his way to Canada to meet with the President of the United States, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Anyway, we had about 5 days sailing across the North Atlantic. Of course, everything was blacked out, and as we had Churchill on board, the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth normally sail on their own, no escorts, because they were so fast on the North Atlantic run. Anyway, we had destroyer escorts in the distance. We could read all the slant signals being flashed between the ships, and, which was quite amusing because the Queen Mary was way too fast for the destroyers. They were having a job keeping up with her at the time. And the weather was quite reasonable indeed. It was autumn, so we weren't too badly off for the weather at sea. We landed in Halifax in Nova Scotia, and I then spent 5 days on a train, and I finished up in a place called Dafoe, D-A-F-O-E, in Saskatchewan, where I started my bombing and gunnery training. That's where I eventually got to fire a machine gun, not Niger, but at least in practice. It was really quite interesting. We learned the art, intricacies of bombing and how to do it and so on. And we used to do practice bombing from an aircraft called an Anson twin-engine communication aircraft, which could carry about 6 or 8 people, but only carried a pilot and the navigator or bomb member rather doing his training. And we did so many at daytime and dropping about 11-pound practice bombs. And in the daytime they produced a smoke puff on the ground, and at night they went off with a flash. So they were recorded on the range, and we had various targets to aim at in the daylight and the dark. And we became quite good at it. I finished top of the course on that thing, so quite pleased with that. Then we went on to Winnipeg, near, well, Winnipeg was the major city. The Port of La Prairie was the name of the airfield. We were about 60 miles west of Winnipeg, and we did our navigation training there. I did the same sort of navigation training as the navigator did, but I only did 6 weeks of it as opposed to 12 weeks for the navigator. And the difference in time was basically the nav spent more time in the air. But I was a fully qualified navigator up to that point. Didn't have enough flight hours to earn on that particular task. Anyway, we graduated from there. We were a mixture on the course of Canadians and RAF. And two of the RAF guys, well, all of them, we all got to know each other quite well, all sharing the same billets and everything. But which was kind of amusing in a way. The Brits always wanted fresh air. They kept opening the down windows because they kept forgetting the temperature outside was not exactly sunny bright by the beach. It was quite cold indeed, so that created a bit of an uproar where we managed to get that little trouble sorted out. Anyway, I graduated there. I'm fortunate on the top 3 as commissioned. And I had a choice of either going back to England or staying in Canada as an instructor, or staying on a higher level bombing course on moving targets, which to me meant flying in coastal command at sea for hours on end. Didn't appeal to me much, and staying in Canada didn't rank high in my list of priorities, so I naturally opted to come back to England and get into what I'd been trained for in bombing. So I came back to England and spent some time up based in Scotland, learning how to fly in the dark. In Canada, nothing was blacked out. It was the same as in America. Lights were on everywhere, so finding your way around was not too difficult, even though you were learning the basics of navigation. Anyway, I got back to England, spent some time in the southwest corner of Scotland, flying again in Ansons, getting some navigation time in, and learning some of the types of equipment we'd be using in the future. So I went from there up to the north of Scotland to learn operational training at the OTE, Operational Training Unit. There we were going to fly Wellingtons, a twin-engine It was designed by Barnett Wallace, who became famous later, before that actually, on the dam buster bombs that blew up the modern Eder dams. Actually, Gibson, who led that raid on the dams, had come over on the Queen Mary with us, with Churchill, on a speaking tour in North America, and gave us a little talk on how they managed to do it. It was really quite fascinating. Anyway, this is where we all got crewed up, and what they did was they get 100 pilots, 100 navigators, 100 bomb aimers, and 100 wireless operators, and 200 gunners. And you've got 2 weeks to make yourself into a crew, which is very interesting, because when you look at it, you don't know a soul, but in 2 weeks you get to know, bump into everybody, and sooner or later you get sorted out as a crew. I was quite lucky in mine. Excuse me. I was walking back to the billet one night from the mess, having a bite to eat, and I heard footsteps behind me, and I looked round, and there was a pilot navigator approaching, and the pilot said, "You've got a crew yet?" And I said, "It looks as though I have not, doesn't it?" And they sort of laughed about it, and that was how we crewed up. So they'd already picked up the 2 gunners. They were from the same town as the pilot, and the wireless operator had met Des, our navigator, on the train coming up, so they were sort of friendly with each other, and that, all of a sudden we had a crew of 6, which was really quite good. We did pick up the engineer later on when we went to train on 4-engined aircraft. Anyway, that was our crew formed. Nobody knew anything. Yes, our navigator had been a Cambridge student in England, so he was highly qualified. He failed his pilot's course and finished up as navigator. Jeff, the pilot, was in charge, and actually as a captain, and he'd been instructing as a flight instructor on Tiger Mouse. So he'd quite a lot of hours in, but all in the light aircraft. So now we were getting in at the deep end, flying on the Wellington. And we were transferred from the master base down to a satellite about 12 miles away, which in actual fact turned out to be very, very good indeed. It was a much more friendly atmosphere, and you got to know the instructors, who were basically people who'd been on operations and were tour expired. They'd done their 30 missions and were doing a ground tour of 6 months in a teaching on some professional or navigation or radio or engines and so on, depending on the quality of the aircraft and such like. It was really quite fascinating. We did all the usual training, parachute training, dinghy training, where we learned how to inflate rubber dinghies. You spent some time in the swimming pool doing all that sort of stuff, learning how to inflate the dinghy if you ditched or if you bailed over the water. So it was, you learned a pretty good insight as to what was being done. And of course, you learned how we did the bombing. It was all done at night, of course, in those days. And it was quite different from daylight stuff. And our navigation training, we mainly flew over the North Atlantic from Scotland, heading out towards Iceland, in that general direction. So the chance of meeting any enemy aircraft was slim and none, but at least you got what it was like to fly really dark. One thing I did like about it, being so far north in Scotland, you could see the northern lights quite frequently, and that was a sight to behold. It really is something you can't describe. It's just incredible amount of colour, light reflecting off the ice caps in the North Pole area and so on. It really buggers up the radar big time, but it was really worthwhile. We learned an awful lot there. And we went from there down to England. We were going to be on number 4 group, which meant flying Halifax aircraft, which is quite, it doesn't get quite the publicity at the Lancaster. The Lanc could carry 14,000 pounds of bombs. The Halifax, we could only carry 12, which was just quite a good size load. To give you some idea, a B-17 could only carry 4,000 pounds of bomb, and the B-24 could carry 6. So we carried quite a good load. It was usually a 4,000 pound cookie or a high capacity bomb, and cans of incendiary. It depended on the target and what the bomb load would be. Anyway, we finished up down in England learning to fly the Halifax, and that's when we picked up the crewman, flight engineer. And it so happened that Jeff, our pilot, had him, the engineer, as a pupil, and somehow they were short of engineers, so he'd been on pilot training, and all of a sudden he woke up as a flight engineer. So we picked up an engineer then, and we're now a crew of 7, which was the standard operational crew in Bomb Command. So that was, by this time, the war was pretty well on. It was the end of 44. The chances of getting into action were thinning down markedly, because we'd had D-Day in 44, were fighting our way across Europe at that time. So the targets were out of France, were mainly bombing German targets by then. So one of our graduation flight from operational heavy conversion unit, as it was called, was to do a moon, what the hell did we call it now? The name will come to me. Anyway, it was a dummy raid. We'd go out dropping leaflets and a window, which was now known as chaff. That's the metallic strips, rather like the tinsel you throw on a Christmas tree at Christmas time. And that has got to have the wavelength of the German radar. It was going to jam, and because it would come up on the German radar as a whole flock of aircraft coming up, and there's only one aircraft shoveling out this window. Actually, there's more than one. There was a whole bunch of us on this particular raid. I can't think of the name. But anyway, that was our baptism of fire. You flew in towards the Germany, shoveling this stuff out over a predetermined time, so it would appear in the German radar. And the aim was to divert the German fighter towards us, while the main force went in somewhere else, and then further north on the German coast or wherever. So it was quite an effective raid. It was used quite as a standard tactic every night, practically. So all the conversion units supplied to some crews to do this. That was the one that turned out to be a one-way trip for us. We had major problems coming down from about 18,000 feet down to 5,000 feet over France. By that time, we were across the bomb line, which was the front line, where it just so happened in that area, George Patton was there with his Third Army rushing into Germany. So we got the order to jump because all the engines suddenly stopped at just about the same time. And the pilot, I happened to I just taken a fix on my radar set and was passing it to Des, and I happened to glance at the altimeter, and it was reading 3,500 feet. I said, "You better watch it, there's some hills around this area." So that's when he mentioned the fact that the engines had stopped. I hadn't noticed the fact we'd been throttled back on the way down from height, and they put it down to carburetor rising. I still doubt that, because to get 4 engines to quit one at almost at the same time, and I think the engineer put us on empty tanks, but I can't say one way or the other. Anyway, we got the order to jump, and that's what we had to do. We had to bail out. Of course, I shot into the nose of the aircraft where my parachute was packed away, up on the right-hand side by the bomb site. And I remember glancing out the nose of the aircraft, which was all perspex, so I could see we were in a cloud over, that was for sure. And it was a sort of grace effect. And I came back through and pulled the curtains that I got back on where it was light, where all the navigation lights were inside the aircraft. And I expected to see a hole in the floor, because Des and I, the navigator, and my boy, we were side by side in the Halifax, and we both had our own radar equipment to fiddle around with. So I expected Des had opened the hatch. What I didn't realise, he'd never opened a hatch in his life. And he didn't know that you had to turn the handle half a turn to open it. And I couldn't see because it both hands on pulling like mad, and we'd have been pulling still. But I looked at his helmet and said, it looks like we're going out the back, and he turned around and zoomed off. I didn't see him until the next day. I never thought to check the hatch because I assumed he'd tried turning it. Anyway, by that time, the wireless operator, Morris, was getting out of his seat, which sat underneath the pilot, and I couldn't afford to stand in his way, so I headed for the back end of the aircraft, which is what we did. We all bailed out of the rear and the normal entry hatch. So as I passed by the MiG fuel control, there were some red lights on there, and the engineer was fiddling with something, and I thought he hadn't held the order to jump, so he yelled at him, he got to jump, and then he nodded, and by that time the wireless op was behind me, and I was blocking his passage. Not a lot of room in these airplanes. Anyway, so I had to get down to the back end in a hurry, and got there just as my mid-upper gunner opened the hatch, and he sat down to give him a push, and out he went, and I dived out after him. And that's how we got on. And I didn't do this count to 5 or whatever you're supposed to do. As soon as I got out, my hand was on the D-ring, and I think that the wind probably pulled it out for me. I remember pulling, and I could hear the whir of the shirt lash unwinding, and I seemed to be dropping on my back, and I did that when the chute opened, and the result was one of my flying boots flew off my left one and sailed off into the dark, and I managed to keep the other one on by slamming my legs together, and that saved that bit. So I got that thing squared away, and I was falling, couldn't see it, it's still a cloud, and I yelled out to see if Jimmy was okay, but he could hear it, but he couldn't hear what I was saying. So, and the next thing I knew, I was in the tree, and I was down on the ground in France, just having arrived by parachute. So that was the start of quite a few things, oddball things that were going to happen that night. Because I expected to hear an explosion because we were still full of fuel and there was nothing. And I began to wonder, did we hear somebody saying it that was broadcast, trying to make sense out of why the hell we jumped, and there was no explosion. So anyway, they managed to get the aircraft flying again, and the pilot and engineer flew north and landed with it on an American base further north. And of course, we'd been so low when we gave the order to jump, Jeff thought we'd all died in too low for the chutes to open. So he was pretty depressed about the whole damn thing, naturally, he and the engineer. And of course, the rest of us, we were hale and hearty, so to speak, except for our tail gunner. He almost declared the aircraft unfit to fly because the doors are about yay wide, and it takes 2 to open to give you a room to get in and out of the turret. And one of the doors had been sticking and it didn't work properly. And he said, I thought, that will be okay. And unfortunately, it wasn't okay. He had to get out, and he was a big chap. He was a black guy from Jamaica, and he used to feel the cold, and a tremendous amount of cold weather clothing on inside the harness. And in the process of getting out of the turret, he bent one of the buckles where you clip the harness in, and that got bent, and when the chute opened, only one side worked. And that came around, smashed all his face in, and he came down hanging by one shroud line and crashed into the trees that way and cracked a few ribs as well. He was damn lucky they got to him in time. And the American Army, they may have had the segregation at first, but the people in the ER saved his life. There's no two ways about it. And I didn't see him till after the war, when he came to visit us up in the Squadron in metal plates instead of teeth at that time, because nowadays you'd have plastic surgery to fix him up. Because he was a good-looking guy. Anyway, that was the only casualty. The Wallace operator got some of the trees, brushed his face and scratched it up a bit. That was about it. I got away with not a damn mark on me at all. Fortunately, I shouldn't have done it, but I'd kept my helmet on. It was sort of lying at the back of my head. So I used that as a shield and was able to hop my way down through the forest. And in the forest, you can't tell sound. I could hear traffic all night long. I didn't know where the hell it was coming from. And I knew we were behind the lines because we were over the bomb line when we bailed out. So that was a good thing on my part. So come the dawn night and it got light. Of course, it doesn't get light till about 5 in the morning in that latitude at that time of year. And I was able to see the trees and found a little path in the forest and followed that. Got to the edge of the forest, I was on a hill, and then sweeping down at the bottom of the hill, there was traffic on a highway. So I had my little dingy whistle that we always wore up here. So that was there. If you fell in the ocean, you could blow a whistle on, and then your buddies in the rubber dinghy could paddle over and fish you out of the water. That was the theory of it anyway. Anyway, I blew the whistle and a jeep stopped, which was great. I thought, first class. Unfortunately, two French soldiers were driving it, so I'd had French at school, but asking where the pen was on the table or something, and French was going to get me anyway. I had enough to get by anyway. And I requested they take me into the nearest military post, and of course they were in army uniform, so they took me into the local police station of a town called Saint-Dizier, D-I-Z-E-I-E-R, and they hooked me up with the French gendarmes, and 6 of the biggest cops I've ever seen marched me down the main street. They didn't know what the hell they'd got, because Patton had swept through there just about a week before, so they was picking up shadows everywhere, and the army uniform, sort of a greyish colour, looked like a little sort of Germanic in a way. So anyway, they took me down and turned me over to the Americans, and they were 2 nice intelligence officers. I gave them all the details and who we were and what had happened. And they told me they'd picked up 5 guys. One of them was injured, and that was, of course, the tail gun, and they were bringing them in. So I was the first one into civilization, if you could call it that. So we got into discussing the type of trip we were on and what we were doing and so on. And I gave them all the names of the crew and everything tied up with what they were getting, so they knew we were not spies, which was all to the good. So these 2 officers were billeted with a French chef, and I had a meal that I liked, which I don't know what the hell I ate, but it was delicious. And they had American rations, and this guy could really cook. And so they were living high in the hall on this private house. So it was all very interesting. I got back to the main base and I said, can you get me a pair of boots? And I only had one, so they said, sure. So I called the sergeant, they asked me what size. I told them. They said, get the lieutenant a pair of size 7. So I got a pair of boots. And that impressed the hell out of it. They were brand new, and we could have been more than 20 odd miles behind the front lines. I was really impressed. These guys traveled in style, no 2 ways about it. Anyway, I just put my boots on when the rest of the crew came in, and then came Jimmy carrying my anti-flying boot. They found it in the forest. It must have been about a trillion to one shot. So anyway, I got my 2 boots back, so I thanked them for the loan of the boots, and that was it. So their operational procedures ended down the aircraft to get them up to Paris right away. So we were carted out to a nearby airfield, American one, and it flew us in the C-47. It was a long flight out to Paris. I don't know which airport we landed in, but there we got turned over to the RAF, and things changed quite dramatically. Des and I were the only 2 commissioned officers, and Jimmy and Morris, the gunner and the wireless operator, were NCOs. So they got billeted with the military police in some hotel, and Des and I finished up in a hotel somewhere, I have no idea. Anyway, we arranged that we'd meet 2 NCOs outside for the evening, and they came by to pick us up, and we all went out to a club. It was sort of an officers' club, actually, and Des and I were treated with, but we were given pretty preferential treatments by being commissioned anyway. But we arranged to meet the NCOs outside at a predetermined time, and it's the only time in my life I've ever passed out for too much to drink. But I'd never drunk champagne cocktails in my life, and I was down in these things. They were like 7-Up, so it was really tasty. Anyway, Des, I remember him slapping my face and said, "We're on our way." I said, "Oh, but within a minute, it left me there. If he'd propped me up, I'd probably have made it." And I don't remember a thing after that, but apparently I was carted out of there by 2 very senior officers. And I vaguely remember my pads being pulled off, and I was back in my own bed in this hotel again. So that was my only night in Paris. I didn't remember a thing about it, unfortunately. Des and the 2 crew members, they had a real good time together. Anyway, the next day they flew us back to England, and of course by that time we figured out that the aircraft must have stayed airborne. It was down somewhere, and that is exactly what happened. They were diverted up to an American base. They then flew the crew back to England. There was only 2 of them anyway, the pilot and engineer, and they didn't know we were alive, so I walked into the bar about 3 days later when we go back to England. That's when Jeff knew I was alive. So I filled him in what the hell that happened to us all. It's very interesting, actually. We had broken the golden rule. You were never supposed to carry money with you in case you were shot down. That meant there was no money for the Germans to use. Anyway, we always carried about a couple of pounds of money, and of course in Paris we were able to use that and buy perfumes for the girlfriends, so it wasn't a bad side issue to it. Anyway, we flew back to England and eventually got back to the Squadron and got all sorted out. Had a week's survivors leave, the whole enchilada. That was quite interesting. I was back up to Scotland for a week, and then came back down and started ops and serious work on the Squadron. But the war was just about over by that time. We were doing sort of dust-up operations over Germany. And of course the war eventually finished on May the 10th, and peace reigned supreme, but it didn't on the base. All of a sudden you have all these aircrew with nothing to do. So we got the job, our squadron was given the job of taking all the bombs on all the airfields in our group and dumping them in the North Sea, which was entertaining but kind of boring in many ways. you'd just fly down to another base, they'd load up the aircraft with a full bomb load, no detonators in it, so they dropped them all safe, and they'd take them out about 150 miles and dump them in the North Sea. And they'd come back, you'd have lunch, they'd fill it up again, and you'd go back and do another one in the afternoon. So that way we got rid of all these bombs on all the various bases. Then we started flying our aircraft off to maintenance units, where they were going to be put in storage, we thought at that time. And the crew, all of a sudden our group transferred from Bomber Command to Transport Command. Obviously you didn't need bomb bombers and Transport Command, so we were then put out on the various jobs, learning how to load an aircraft, which was really quite fascinating. I'd never given it much thought before. You just stuck the bombs in, that was it. But these, you had passengers, and they could move around all over the damn place. So you had to make sure you got everybody weighed, and they all sort designated seats and so on. So we learned all of these techniques, and we transferred, lost the crew completely. I was then on a ground-based job, and most of the crew were ex-air crew anyway, in Transport Command. And they were landing on we were using some bombers that had been, Stirling was one of them. I got the aircraft, fill it with little portable seats, and they used it as a transport to fly troops back from India, Burma, and so on, and Far East and the Middle East, bring them back to England, rather than let them sail 6 weeks on a ship to get back home. They could be back in 6 days. Unfortunately, we had 1 or 2 crashes that way, and I felt sorry for the guys that had roughed it out in India and Burma for 2 or 3 years, and then they get killed on the way home. But that's the way it was. Anyway, I progressed up the chain of command, and I'm never sure quite why, but anyway, I finished up at the group headquarters outside the town of Oxford, which was really quite good. It was kind of a fascinating place. I was dating a girl there, and her parents owned a very big country house, and quite a few people stayed there. And one of the people that I met was the Russian spy, Edward Fuchs, F-U-C-H-S, and he was a hell of a nice guy, Claudius Fuchs. And he was famous for giving all the secrets on the atomic bomb to Stalin. In fact, Stalin knew more about the American bomb than the president or vice president Truman did. He didn't know a thing about it till Roosevelt died and he became president. And that to me was a criminal negligence on Roosevelt's part, not cutting your number 2 man in. Anyway, the rest is history. He used it, and very wisely so, used both of them and finished the war once and for all. But that was my career at that time. I enjoyed staying in the Air Force. I was starting demob to let people get up, and I kind of liked it. I'd always wanted to fly, and to get back and flying, I obviously couldn't do it as a bomb aimer in Transport Command, so I applied for pilot training. My pilot had trained me to fly the airplane anyway. In fact, he was a frustrated gunner, so I could fly the plane at night and he'd go down to the tail turret and bang off a few rounds just for fun. So I got the hang of flying a big airplane. He never let me land the damn thing, but I could do all instrument flying, approaches, this, that, and the other. So I felt quite confident I'd be okay as a pilot. The next thing I knew, I was on the navigation refresher course. So my flying days were interrupted again. This time I finished as a fully so-called trained navigator. I'd done it all anyway, so it was really a refresher course. Night fighting radar. I became, with that, I learned all right enough. I was back in the old Wellington again. we used it as a fighter, of course, with plenty of room, excuse me, to put all this equipment in and have your radar instructor sitting beside you, watching what you did. So I learned how to pass that up, and that's when we crewed up with a pilot, because you only have one pilot and one navigator and a night fighter, which is what I was being trained for. So we did our training on that. We went to conversion unit where the pilot learned to fly the Mosquito anyway, which was quite a tricky aeroplane to fly. That made of wood. It was the fastest twin-engine fighter in World War II. It could carry 4,000 pounds to Berlin and do 2 trips in one night. You just change the crew, put a new bomb and fill it up with fuel, and off she'd go again. Berlin was 650 miles away from England. This flew at 350 miles an hour at 35,000 feet, so there was no problem getting there and back without probably being shot at. So it was a good aeroplane at that time in the war. There's lots of things I can talk about that. Anyway, the training, that's the first time, I've never flown higher than 20,000 feet in the Halifax, and then all of a sudden with the Mossie I could get up to 35,000. And I took part in a NATO exercise over Belgium, and flying at 30,000 feet, I was looking down on the clouds, and the frontal system had gone through our base, and I could see the thunderstorm going off inside the cloud, lighting it all up. It was really quite fascinating. I loved it, and I loved the Mossie. You sit side by side, slightly behind the pilot, and you could see everything. Of course, you didn't have a big table to work on like you had in Halifax. So everything was on a piece of wood about this size on your lap, and your maps were stuck down your trouser leg beside you, inside your boot. So, excuse me, a different kind of navigation, to say the least. Anyway, I graduated out of Squadron, 29 Squadron. We had the multi-30 and 36. The difference was in the engines, a slight difference in performance, but really fun to fly. And I love flying in the Mossie because everything's going by high speed, and it's a different type of navigation from when you're sitting there with a little radar set, plotting stuff out, everything on the charts. It was quite different. You're map reading and doing it, to get used to doing it at high speed. There's a 300 odd mile an hour at deck level, 50 feet or 100 feet. Things are going by pretty damn quick, and I loved it. It was really great fun. So you didn't get to do too much of it because there were areas where you could do legally low fly. Sometimes you'd do some on your own, but you're taking a chance on your number being caught and somebody complaining about it. Over the water, different thing entirely. Anyway, I finished up on 29. We were just about to convert to the Meteor jet night fighter, which was fine. I managed to get a couple of trips in with the training, the Mark 7, which was the 2-seat trainer. My CEO gave me a wing commander, Shaw, one of his squadron leader at that time, Mike Shaw, very experienced pilot. I loved flying with him. And my own pilot, Dick Grant, was pretty damn good. He was an NCO, which I never rank didn't mean a damn thing to me. And once you're airborne, as long as you can fly that thing, get us back in one piece, that's all that really mattered. So it was really entertaining. From there, I was posted up to Scotland to reform a squadron, 150 Squadron, on jet night fighters, in first night fighter in Scotland, at a place called St Andrews, which is famous for golf, the home of golf actually. It's the sort of mecca where people from all over the world come to play there. we used to get people dropping in and all sorts of aircraft, mainly Americans from based all over Europe at that time. They fly up to Scotland to play golf. It was kind of entertaining. We had two damn good players on the squadron. We used to say, yeah, they'll show you around, and play them for a few pounds and made a small fortune at it. They were damn good. Anyway, it was in D Squadron. It was the first night fighter squadron formed in the RAF in World War I. June 12th, 1918, Havilland, Essex was the name of the town where they were formed. Of course, they didn't have anything in the way of radar. It was just a turret at the front of the aircraft, and there was a gunner in that. Oddly enough, I met a guy who'd been in one of those gunners in that turret in World War I. And I wanted him to come up to the squadron. This was down in London at a club I belonged to. And they never did want to come up to Scotland. I said, we'll pay for everything. Don't you worry, you'll be a guest of honour. And it would be great to visit the squadron and see what it was like now. And if he wanted to, we'd get him a ride in a jet. And it turned it down, I don't know why. Anyway, that was by the by. So we reformed this thing with the Havilland Vampire, which was a two-seat. It was really a two-seat single-engine fighter made to seat two, pilot on the left side, navigator on the right, and the radar set was in the nose. Twin booms and the jet pipe twist E-flushed out between the booms at the back end. It was good for about 40,000 feet. That was about it. Your range was about an hour and a bit. Fuel, and if you had wing tanks on, you'd get about an hour and a half to an hour and 3/4, as I recall, with the aircraft. It was pretty good in that respect. And of course, most of our interceptions were over the North Sea. Anything coming in from Russia would have come down that way into Scotland and northern. And my future in the Air Force was all going to be in jets. I did 20 years, and by that time I was halfway through, just about. So the rest will have to come at a later date. But it was really quite interesting what I did from then on. Of course, what I'd done in Transport Command, I flew all over the world, in the Middle East, Far East, India. Didn't get down into Burma, but saw quite a bit of India, and then down into Africa, Rhodesia, so Tripoli, so all of that. Europe, in and out of Europe all the time. I spent quite some time on the Berlin airlift back in 47, 48, so I got to know quite a bit about that. I got into Berlin twice, never did get off the airfield. We flew in and out of Gatow, which was on the southwest corner of Berlin, and the Americans landed in Tempelhof, which was right in Berlin. So they developed the Candy bombers, which have one sitting outside here, which became quite famous, and mainly keeping people supplied. And of course, the man in charge of it all was General Curtis LeMay. And the Russians knew if they interfered with any of the transport aircraft in any way, Moscow would have disappeared within the hour. And they knew it, and they knew he meant it. And he was a real tough guy, a brilliant man. I never had the pleasure of meeting him. I did get an autograph copy of his book by his daughter, as he wrote a fine book on his career, which was quite brilliant. It's up in the library here somewhere. Anyway, that's by the by. So that would take me up to when I, just prior to my coming to America, to fly with the Marine Corps. That was back in 1954. I came out to do exchange duty with the American Marines, as they had about the same problems that the RAF had, and size and communications and the amount of equipment we had at that time. And I got involved in the radar development before I came over to America, so I was familiar with the American equipment. I'd used it quite extensively in the RAF, and I'd had two Marines working with me on 29 Squadron, Major Thompson and Master Sergeant Larry Thornton. He was the navigator.
Wow.
I love a nice guy. Had one of the biggest cars I'd ever seen in my life. Of course, by British standards, in America it was quite normal, but to me it was huge.
Wow.
And to see him master that thing down a British country lane on his way to a pub with a bunch of boys in the car was quite something. He was really good with it. Hell of a nice guy, married with two very nice kids. So that was bring me up to about 1954 when I first came over here. That's a good point to take a break.
All righty. Okay, I think I'll go
I'll
ahead.
do for one today.
Yes.